Hello, Mark Laudi here at the World Intellectual Property Forum, WIPF in Bangkok. We're here at the PitchMark exhibit, and as you can tell, it is a particularly packed day 2 here at the conference. Tomorrow, we'll be hearing from one of the specialists from the United States who'll be talking about what it's like when you take somebody to court over copyright infringement. Bob Zeidman, founder of Zeidman Consulting, joins us. Thanks very much for joining us here at the conference, Bob.
Yeah, Mark, thanks for having me.
Now, you're going to be talking about the desperate need for standardization in the detection of copyright infringement. Walk us through what currently the problem is that you're solving.
Sure, the problem is that there are techniques, in fact, I've developed some techniques that are used worldwide for copyright infringement, for example, detecting software copyright infringement. But what I find is I go up against experts on other sides who use what I'll call their own techniques. So a lot of times what happens is that they'll come and support their client, especially, to be honest, especially a client who is guilty of copying software. They'll find an expert who will come up with statistics. Often these are professors or very credible people at professors at universities, for example, who will come up with some mathematical formulations to say, well, you know, I've done this comparison, I've looked at the file names, I've looked at the code, I use my software. Sometimes it's proprietary software that they've come up with just for this case. And they'll say that my findings are that 0.01% of the code is copied, which is meaningless, or none of it is copied. And the problem is they're using techniques that haven't been approved in the courts and are often wrong. In fact, one example I can give you is years ago, when I first got into this industry as an expert, I talked to a few people who were involved in some very big software copyright infringement cases. And they said, oh, we counted white space. In other words, we counted the number of tabs and spaces in the code. And they said, even though in this case they were accusing a party of copying code, they said even though they had changed everything about the code, we could find the patterns of the white spaces, 3 tabs in the beginning and 4 spaces over here. So my team and I actually did research. We took thousands of lines of open source code, probably millions of bytes, tens of millions of bytes, and we tried various techniques to compare white space, and what we found is just randomly stuff matched, and none of this was related. And yet people were using this in court, in that case, to accuse companies of copying code. So my solution is I came up with a number of algorithms and processes for doing this. They've been accepted in courts worldwide, but I'd love it for it to be a standard, not just because it's mine, because it's frustrating going up against experts who come up with their own techniques that haven't been proven in the field.
So the applications here, you mentioned code, so I'm assuming software code, but any other forms of copyright infringement where you see a similar kind of dreamt up ways of substantiating their claims?
So I can't say for sure. I've mostly been involved in software copyright, but I have seen other cases. Copyright becomes very subjective, unfortunately. So recently I was researching an article on copyright infringement, and I found, if you know George Harrison's song, My Sweet Lord, which was accused of being a copy of the old song, He's So Fine. And I never knew what the details of that were. And I read into it, and it turns out there were just a few chords in a melody, not even the entire melody, but a few chords in a melody that were identical. And based on that, the jury decided that George Harrison had copied the song. I'd love to see standards in other areas too, like music, like art. We have some stuff going on right now, but a lot of copyright infringement is subjective. The nice thing about code, because code is so very specific, written in a very specific way, in a specific language, you can use the techniques I've developed. You could use them in art, you could use them in novels, you could use them in songs, in theory. And I'd love to expand it to that, but so far nobody's asked me to do that.
So in other words, it is actually not a subjective thing at all to be able to prove your copyright claim. What you're saying is that an algorithm could have a very scientific way of either proving or disproving your ownership of that copyright.
That's exactly true. But to be clear, the algorithms I've developed take hundreds of thousands of files and narrow it down to maybe hundreds of areas that look like they could have been copied. It still takes an expert to go through the software code and say, was this copied? But now it becomes a manageable job as opposed to hundreds of thousands of files, people can't go through them. And before I came up with my techniques, people would just, basically guess. I was once brought in as a neutral expert on a case where I think it was something like University of Helsinki, where one expert was in the computer science department at the University of Helsinki, and the other was the head of the department at the same university. And reading the reports, they just said, well, I've looked at so much code in my lifetime, I can tell this is copied. And the other one said, well, I've looked at even more code in my lifetime, and I can tell it's not copied. But there was no basis for it. So that was the incentive for me to start creating some algorithms and some techniques subjected to exhaustive tests. Unfortunately, it's worked, but still there are people out there using stuff that they've just created.
Of course, the judges don't have an easy job in weighing these things up. They're doing the best they can. We always rely on the courts to come up with the fair judgments. How much more confusing does it then get for them when there aren't these standards?
I think that's a really good point. I think of two specific examples. One case I had in the US, a big company sued a small company, and the expert on the other side made up a bunch of mumbo jumbo that made no sense. And I thought I pointed that out. In fact, my client and the attorneys and I went to a celebratory dinner afterwards. We were certain we'd won. It was so clear that I'd had a process for doing everything, and the other expert just talked off the top of her head. And in the end, the judge he thought he was being solemn, and he split the baby. There were 56 trade secrets, 56 trade secrets at issue. And the judge at the end, his ruling said, well, I didn't really understand any of the technology, so I'm going to say these 28 trade secrets belong to this company and these 28 belong to this company. And unfortunately, my client was a startup and they couldn't afford to rewrite half their code, so they went out of business. The other thing I've seen along those lines is, this is unfortunate, I was in a case in Australia and they have a different system than in the US, and they had all the experts sit together as me for the plaintiff and two university professors for the defendant. So first of all, I think the optics look bad to the judge. There's two professors versus one non-professor, two Australians versus one non-Australian. And the professors are very nice people, but they basically said, well, our client only copied a little bit of code. So they admitted to that. And the judge actually said, first of all, I had not used the correct terms that are applicable in Australian law for copyright. I used the terms applicable in US law. Nobody had corrected me. I didn't realize there was a difference. And based on my lack of terminology and the two professors who said it wasn't really a lot of copying, the judge declared no copyright infringement. Whereas, as I hope most people would know, a little bit of copying of critical stuff is still copyright infringement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you see a solution in technology to help judges make more black and white decisions?
Well, that's where I'm hoping the standards would come in. I think if judges see, here's a standard, so you have to follow the standard, and within that standard, if you do these processes, run these tools, do these processes, come to this conclusion, at least you've narrowed down what we're looking at. As opposed to, one person did one set of algorithms and statistics, and the other one did a completely different one. It's apples and oranges, and to someone who doesn't understand the technology. Now, I should say I pride myself on explaining to judges, and in the vast majority of my cases, I've explained to them what the issue is, and they understand. But there are these outliers where the judge just throws up his or her hands and says, "Yeah, I don't understand."
Bob, we look forward to your presentation tomorrow. Thank you for walking us through it here at WIPF. Bob Zeidman from Zeidman Consulting. And I'm Mark Laudi. Look out for us again on our YouTube channel and Facebook page. And we'll continue to bring you highlights from our conference here.